byproduct of this great industrial revolution. In fact, if you watch Downton Abbey on PBS television, you have to ask yourself a simple question. What happened to the great manors and the great mansions of old? What happened to them? These mansions employ perhaps 100 servants serving the very privileged aristocracy, but what happened? If you read between the lines and listen very carefully to Downton Abbey, you can see that what happened was the coming of the Industrial Revolution. All of a sudden, a farmer, a peasant, didn't have to be a peasant or work on the manor's estate. You could be a worker and work on the railroads. You could work in a factory. You didn't have to have slave wages working for the master in an aristocratic manner. No, you could work in a factory. And so with the rise of steam power came the rise of the working class. Peasants, farmers rushed to the cities to become industrial workers. And then we had the second great revolution in science and technology, and that's the coming of electricity, magnetism, and the internal combustion engine. Yes, we physicists were able to work out Maxwell's equations which govern electricity and magnetism, and also perfect a new source of energy. Instead of calculating how many joules of energy you could extract from a lump of coal, we could calculate precisely how many joules of energy we could extract from a gallon of gasoline. And that created the rise of industrial unionism. Yes, the great working class unions of Detroit emerged out of the cauldron of this second great revolution, the revolution in electricity, magnetism, and the internal combustion. And again, for the second time in history, this created a bubble even bigger than the bubble of 1850.
We're all hearing about the opposition to the Dakota Access Pipeline lately, but do protesters know what's at stake?
This bubble was in two areas. If you trace back the crash of 1929, you realize that most of the speculation took place in two kinds of stock. One was utility stock because of the rise of electricity and magnetism, and the rise of the automobile. And so again, two revolutions unleashed by physicists created wealth on a scale that was unimaginable in the 1920s. It created a bubble which crashed in 1929. And so you begin to realize that the crash of 1929 was very similar to the crash of 1850, coinciding with the rise of a new source of science and technology. This time the car, and electricity and magnetism. And this also, of course, created a revolution in the working class. The working class now became unionized in these gigantic unions, ultimately creating the AFL-CIO. And it also changed the political scene of the United States for many generations. This was the rise of the Roosevelt Coalition. The Roosevelt Coalition cobbled together three main factors of American society after 1929. First of all, you had the white industrial unionized worker, the bedrock of the Roosevelt Coalition. Then you had African Americans, and then you had urban workers and intellectuals. A combination of these three legs created the Roosevelt Coalition, which in turn dominated American politics until recently. And so we see that the rise of the second great revolution created not just the industrial working class, it created the industrial unions and the Roosevelt Coalition. Then we have the third wave of science and technology. And the third wave was initiated again by physicists who created the transistor and the laser. The transistor made possible the computer and all the labor-saving devices and the internet. And the laser, of course, is found everywhere, from the supermarket all the way to satellites and to lasers. And this created good and bad changes in society. First of all, the third wave made possible globalization. Because the internet reduced the distances between societies, it meant that technology could spread rapidly at the speed of light. I remember when I was a grad student, and if you were a poor student in India subscribing to a physics journal, you had to wait months for the journal to arrive, if it arrived at all. And that, of course, impeded scientific progress and industrialization. Now we see that China is basically industrializing in one generation. This had never happened before in the history of the human race. The rapid rise of industrialization, in part due to globalization and the coming of the internet. This also made possible the education of the people of the world because of the internet. The high-tech revolution made possible the internet and the democratization of knowledge. All of a sudden, people in an oppressed nation realized that other countries didn't have to suffer under a dictatorship, and this gave rise to democratic movements, which in turn overthrew many of the dictators of the past. I remember during the Cold War, there was something called the dictator for life. That is, if you were a puppet of the United States or the Soviet Union, you could be guaranteed longevity, at least until the end of the Cold War, because you were a pawn in this much larger game. Now, of course, dictators for life have no meaning at all, because the Cold War is over, and look at all the dictators that have been overthrown just in the past few decades. And so the rise of democracy also means the lessening of wars, because democracies do not war with other democracies. So you see, with the coming of the third wave, we had the benefits, the rise of hundreds of millions of people in China and India rising to the working class. We also had the spread of the internet, the spread of democracy, the spread of globalization, and the spread of democratic forces in many countries around the world. Those are the positive aspects of this globalization. The third wave, energized by the computers. However, there are, of course, bad aspects as well. First of all, you realize that globalization also made possible runaway shops. Runaway shops which hollowed out entire industries. The industrial working class took a blow. The irony is that science and technology created the industrial working class. The irony is that science and technology don't wait for anybody. We now have the rise of computers, the lasers, the rise of high technology and globalization, which means the hollowing out of the industrial working class. And that in turn can explain the rise of Brexit in England and the UK and the rise of Donald Trump here in the United States. You know, some people point to the top 1%. And yes, they have benefited enormously because of globalization. But that, in some sense, misses the big picture. The big picture is that 1/3 of society, plus or minus, of course, but about 1/3 of society actually did very well under the third revolution. High technology was a blessing to about 1/3 of the population, which were globalized, which did live in cities, which knew how to use computers to their advantage. However, two-thirds of American society did not do so well. They've seen their incomes either flatten out or begin to fall. And these are the people that are in part driving the Donald Trump revolution. And we have to realize that about 1/3 of society also went to college. About 2/3 of society did not finish college. And so we see a correlation between wealth, globalization, and a college education. And what links all this together is science and technology. If you know science and technology, you can begin to take advantage of your college education to reap the riches of urban society because you are globalized. Your income is no longer just a question of a local market. Your income now comes from the entire planet Earth. And so globalization has created winners and losers. Now, of course, this is not new. Look at the blacksmith. We no longer have blacksmiths, we no longer have wagon makers, but we don't mourn the fact that we no longer have blacksmiths and wagon makers because we have the automobile and automobile workers with the rise of the industrial unionized working class. But as I said before, science and technology don't wait for anyone. We're now in the third wave of science and technology, and the other downside is that it created a bubble just like the one of 1850, the bubble just like the one of 1929. The bubble was created in 2008, and this time it did not go into railroad stock, it did not go into utility stock and automobile stock, it went into real estate speculation. All this excess capital, the riches created by the high-tech revolution, energized the bubble of 2008. And when it crashed, it wiped out trillions of dollars in wealth. Now, the point here is that you cannot really understand American politics without understanding the waves of technology and science. The first wave, the steam power wave, created the industrial worker. The second wave, that is electricity and magnetism and the car, created the unionized industrial worker. However, the third wave is creating a large service sector, which doesn't pay as much as unionized industrial work, and it is creating a loss of jobs felt in Europe, felt in the United States, and that in turn, in part, explains the rise of Brexit and the rise of Donald Trump. Now, if this thesis that I'm laying out is correct, if it's correct, it means you can also predict the future. Because science and technology are not random. We can see the beginnings of a fourth wave in the creation of wealth in society.